Well, the Egyptian Steel Company only had one major competitor, which was a private steel company owned by Ahmed Ez, who was a crony of the Mubaraks. He was a good friend of Gamal Mubarak and big in the National Democratic Party, the ruling party. Well, guess who buys the state-owned steel company? Ahmed Ez. And my guess is, I couldn't prove this, that Gamal Mubarak makes a call. Said, Ahmed, have I got a deal for you? Everybody doesn't know this yet, but we're going to put it on the block. So if you're in with the regime, or if you're part of the regime, if you're in the ruling family, whatever, you have all kinds of opportunities in privatization for personal aggrandizement of this insider trading sort. And so that helps to concentrate the wealth in the crony regimes. So this deterioration of the developmental state, because the post-colonial states, they created high schools and colleges and universities in very large numbers. They wanted to educate everybody. They created factories, they urbanized, they did all the things that the modernization theorists of the late 50s would approve of, Daniel Lerner and others. But they did it in a way that was somewhat irrational. They created far more university graduates than could actually be absorbed by the economy. And then they turned on the whole program by going to this kind of crony capitalism and privatization, making sure that the state could no longer take care of all those people that it had made its constituents. And at the same time, to be fair, external rents were a big part of a lot of these regimes. They were getting strategic rent, they were getting inputs of aid from the great powers. They had other sources of income. In Egypt, you had the Suez Canal tolls. Egypt had a little bit of petroleum and the Sinai. The external rents declined in value over time, often in these states. And you can see this, Syria lost its Soviet patron. And in the absence of the external rents, they could, another reason existed for which they could not any longer take care of their constituents. So I think that the history of the political economy of the region is key to understanding why these revolts broke out. Of course, the 2008 downturn, the effect that had on guest workers. Egypt's labor force is 25 million. 3 million were abroad. Those 3 million who were abroad were sending back remittances, and in some ways were keeping things afloat. Moreover, going abroad to work was a safety valve. If you were really fed up with the Mubarak regime, you had two choices. You could risk your life opposing it, or you could go get rich in Kuwait, or go to France, or whatever. But in 2008, 2009, the safety valve was closed off. There were no jobs in Kuwait or France. In fact, people were being fired or given less hours in those places because of the downturn. The rise in petroleum prices in 2008, before the crash, also worked its way through the world agricultural system so as to produce very high food prices in 2009, which again hurt people who were on the edge. So in one way or another, the neoliberal policies of the 90s and zeros, crony capitalism and insider trading on the one hand, which create these very narrow, very wealthy elites, and then the downturn of 2008, 2009 are part of this story. Repression of workers and unions is part of the story. Repression of students is part of the story. And the ways in which these groups allied then to blackmail the elite, to get rid of the ruler, on the theory that if you got rid of the ruler, the whole thing would break open. The ruler was like the log that dammed up the river. It seems to me is one way of looking at what happened. And finally, let me just make two remarks very briefly on the outcome. One of the things that I think hasn't been paid enough attention to was the collapse of the Leninist critique of bourgeois democracy. Now, people didn't talk like that necessarily in the Middle East, although the Marxists did, of course. But there was a general sense in the Arab world that parliamentary democracy was not a thing to aspire to back in the 60s, because the Waft, there had been these colonial colonially formed parliaments in Lebanon and Egypt and so forth, which are thought to be under the thumb of the West and to be very corrupt and be full of these large landowners that I talked about. And so they made a bad reputation for parliamentary democracy. Well, it's the most remarkable thing to me as a historian that these young people on the left who made these revolutions primarily, their demand was for free and fair, transparent parliamentary elections. You know, there's this line in one of Solzhenitsyn's novels, one of the Gulag novels, in which one of the intellectuals who's in the Gulag under Stalin said, you know what really surprises me is I'm getting interested in bourgeois democracy. And this could be, you know, the slogan to understand this generation of Arabs. They're getting interested in bourgeois democracy. That was their demand. But unfortunately for them, ideologically at least, they're mostly left of center people, and many of them describe themselves on Twitter and so forth as socialists. They're kind of post-Soviet third world socialists. But who was good at winning elections? Who had been allowed by the regime to kind of be junior partners in the phony elections that had been being held and so knew how to canvass and organize for elections was the religious parties. So Ennahda in Tunisia, well, it hadn't been a junior partner and it had been devastated, but nevertheless they were organized. And the Egyptians, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, turns out the Salafis, who knew, are good at winning elections. The Al-Ahrar party in Yemen is the leading party, is a Muslim fundamentalist party. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, if the regime were overthrown, would almost certainly do very well. So by this demand that they move to parliamentary elections, the leftists who spearheaded the revolutions with street action endangered their own centrality to the movement. And now we see in Egypt and Tunisia, very likely in Libya, it's not the people who made the revolution. It's the people who hung back, who kind of supported it, who were on the fence and so forth. Those are the ones who are doing well in the elections and who will form the governments. This is a great irony, and I think it probably promises further social discontent, because the left is not going to be happy if the religious right-wing parties, who, by the way, not sympathetic mostly to unions, are very pro-private property, in many ways don't actually meet the desiderata of the revolutionaries in any way. If they implement policies that people don't see as fair, you could have a lot more trouble. The final thing I'll say is that these changes in the Arab world are a challenge to the US-dominated Middle East order. The US has been a dominant power in the Middle East, I would argue, since Sadat went over to the United States in the 70s. The Soviet Union was left with like the leftovers, South Yemen, things like that. And even in the 80s lost Saddam, who allied with the Americans. So, but then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States emerges as a hyperpower. Now, hyperpower is, the French called it that, and they don't like it. I think it's an interesting way to look at it, in the sense that in the Cold War you had bipolarity. The Soviets could check the United States. There were things the United States would have liked to do, which it didn't do because it would have interfered with the Soviet sphere of influence, and they didn't want trouble. And where they risked it, you know, in Vietnam, then it didn't necessarily go well for them. So being just one of two superpowers doesn't give you complete freedom of action. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States had nobody to check it. It could do whatever it damn well pleased. Woke up one morning, decided to invade and occupy Iraq. Unfortunately, you know, being checked by another power is sometimes good. You know, it might cause you to be more sober and not take on fantastical enterprises. But the Iraq War really was, I think, a symptom of the hyperpower status of the United States. And I would argue that the Arab Spring marks the other caesura after 1990 in the Gulf War, where it's bringing an end to the U.S. hyperpower status. And this is, there are two things going on. First of all, people power is manifesting itself in Egypt and elsewhere, and in ways that are not going to favor U.S. interests. I think the Camp David peace accords are in some danger. I don't see people going to war, but I think there's going to be a revision of that status quo. I think the security for petroleum exports from the region is clearly endangered by these popular movements. And you know, Israel and oil are the two big things for Washington in the Middle East. I think people power is challenging U.S. hyperpower status. At the same time, the BRICS are emerging as a new power bloc. And you know, had the BRICS wanted to prevent an intervention in Libya, I think they certainly could have. They could just have vetoed the UN resolution 1972. And they are now, the BRICS are blocking any Western intervention in Syria. And I was talking to a French diplomatic, a member of the French diplomatic corps in November, and I said, you know, is there anything anybody could do? And he said, no, because there's no authorization for the use of force, and we simply will not. We will not take action in those circumstances. So I think the BRICS and people power are starting to bring into question the hyperpower of the United States. Thank you.